The fluorescent lights hummed against institutional green walls, a sound like insects trapped in glass, and Margaret Walsh moved through Seattle General's night shift corridors with the kind of invisibility that only comes from being underestimated for 11 months straight. Her badge clattered softly against her ribs as she walked, the sound barely audible above the ventilator wheeze leaking from open doorways. The antiseptic burned her nostrils, sharp and chemical, the same smell that had haunted every hospital from Camp Lejeune to Walter Reed, and she breathed it in without flinching because flinching was something civilians did. Her scrubs were faded blue, the color of hands-off competence, and her brown hair was pulled tight in a regulation bun with gray roots showing because Margaret Walsh had learned long ago that looking remarkable got you killed. She was a ghost in her own life, and that was precisely the point. Room for 47 was at the end of the east corridor, past the supply closet where night shift nurses went to cry and the medication lockbox where nobody asked questions. She paused outside the door for exactly 3 seconds, not out of hesitation, but out of ritual, and then pushed through. The mute Green Beret lay motionless against white sheets, tube snaking from both arms like the roots of something buried. His left ventilator tube hissed its mechanical rhythm. His chest rose and fell in time with the machine's demands, not his own. 11 months of this. 11 months of watching a man breathe because the machine refused to let him stop. Margaret's hands moved across the monitors with practiced precision. Left to right. Never with her back exposed to the door. The cardiac monitor showed a steady sinus rhythm at 62 beats per minute, good. The blood pressure sat at 118/74, stable, unremarkable. Oxygen saturation 98%. Her weathered fingers, the kind that had held together the lives of 847 men and women across 3 continents, moved with the kind of tactical efficiency that made other nurses look sloppy by comparison. She checked the 4 lines, then the Foley catheter, then the endotracheal tube, and with each touch her hands conveyed something that her mouth never would: I know what I'm doing here. Inside her jacket lining, sewn into the fabric where it would never show, was a faded unit patch. Desert tan background, an eagle with spread wings, and beneath it the call sign her son Daniel had worn under this man's command in Tikrit. The captain who brought us home, Daniel had whispered into her ear the night before he deployed, the night before she'd pulled strings that no one knew she had to get herself assigned here, to this hospital, to this room, to this man. The Pentagon had classified the reasons. She'd never tell him. But watching him breathe when he couldn't do it himself was something close to prayer. Vital stable, she whispered, though there was no one to hear. Still here. Still fighting. He brought you home, didn't he? Her voice carried no emotion. Just data. Just information. Just the kind of thing a nurse said to herself during the quiet hours when the world was asleep and the night was the only thing that could understand. He brought you all home. The mute Green Beret's pupils remained fixed and dilated, unchanged. Locked-in syndrome, the chart said. Completely aware. Completely paralyzed. For 11 months he'd been awake inside a body that wouldn't move, and Margaret had been the only one here most nights who seemed to understand that consciousness was the cruelest thing you could leave behind in a vegetative state. Every night she came to room for 47. Every night she checked the machines. Every night she whispered to him like he could hear, like the words mattered, like saying them aloud to his motionless face might somehow matter more than the data on the monitors. She adjusted the 4-drip, careful, measured movements, and that's when she felt it. The way the air changed. The way pressure shifts when someone is watching. She didn't turn around. She didn't flinch. She simply finished what she was doing and then, only then, allowed her eyes to move toward the doorway where Dr. Mercer stood with his pristine white coat and his surgeon's hands and his eyes the color of a man who'd never been told no by anyone who mattered. He was tall in the way that only men with inheritance were tall, not muscular, not earned through work, but stretched out through generations of comfort and expectation. His jawline could cut glass, though it was softened by the way his mouth perpetually curled downward, as if every person he encountered was a disappointment. He wore a Rolex Submariner on his left wrist, $12,000 of watch that had never once been near actual water, and his shoes were Italian leather that would never touch anything as crude as manual labor. He was observing Margaret the way a hunter observes prey that's wandered into the wrong territory, and he was seeing everything except the thing that mattered. He saw weathered hands tracing full lines with practiced indifference. Hands that looked old. Hands that looked tired. He didn't see hands that had held suture kits steady under mortar fire. Hands that had performed emergency cricothyrotomy on a 19-year-old Marine from Tennessee through the sound of incoming rounds. Hands that had done things that would make his surgeon's hands look like a child's drawing. He saw grey roots showing through brown hair pulled tight in a regulation bun, the kind of bun that came from not having time for personal maintenance, from 11 months of working nights and sleeping days and existing in the margins of other people's lives. He didn't see the way she'd worn that same bun the day she carried a Navy Cross back to Norfolk. The day she'd taught a classroom of surgical residents about things Mercer would never even read about in journals because those operations had never been written down. He saw the way she moved through the hospital in the dark hours like she was furniture waiting to be replaced, like she was just another tired nurse in another tired shift, like she belonged to the background of the institution rather than to something much larger than the institution itself. He didn't see the tactical precision in every movement. The way her left foot never crossed in front of her right, stance discipline. The way she maintained peripheral vision even while looking at monitors, situational awareness. The way her shoulders stayed loose and her breathing stayed calm and her fingers never trembled even when they were performing tasks that should have made them shake. "Miss Walsh," he said, and the name came out like an accusation. His voice was high for a surgeon's voice, almost nasal, the kind of voice that belonged to a man who'd learned power from his father's banker rather than from anything he'd earned himself. "Working another night?" "Yes, doctor," Margaret said. She didn't turn around immediately. She finished whatever she was doing first, that was important, that little assertion of priority, and only then did she move. When she did turn, her face was flat. Composed. The kind of face that gave nothing away. Patient vitals remained stable. "Remarkable," Mercer said, and his lips curved into something that wasn't quite a smile. "Given that you're just a nurse. One would think the machines would be doing most of the work." But that wasn't the worst part. What Mercer didn't understand was that Margaret had heard that exact tone before. She'd heard it from officers who'd been promoted above their competence. She'd heard it from men who needed to diminish someone else's competence in order to feel secure in their own fragile authority. She'd heard it from colonels and generals and once from an admiral whose hand had trembled when she'd corrected his battlefield triage protocol and saved 47 lives because of it. She knew exactly what she was dealing with. A surgeon who was brilliant enough to be dangerous but not brilliant enough to understand how little that mattered in the face of someone who'd actually seen war. She looked at him for exactly 2 seconds, long enough to establish eye contact, short enough that it wasn't confrontational, and then she looked away. "The patient needs to be repositioned. I'll continue monitoring." Mercer watched her for a moment longer, his expression hardening in a way that suggested he'd expected more of a reaction. Anger, maybe. Defensiveness. The kind of response that would have given him something to work with. Instead, he got nothing but steady competence and the kind of calm that only comes from people who've already survived the worst. His hands, those expensive surgeon's hands, clenched at his sides. "Fine," he said finally. "Just make sure you're following protocol. I'd hate to see any irregularities in your charting." It was a threat disguised as concern, and they both knew it. Margaret simply nodded, and when Mercer turned and walked back toward the elevator, his footsteps loud against the tile floor, the sound of someone who was used to being heard, she waited until the doors closed before she turned back to the mute Green Beret in room for 47. She placed her hand on his shoulder, careful not to disturb the 4 lines, and she whispered something that would have gotten her fired if anyone had been there to hear it. "Still here," she said quietly. "I'm still here." The conference room at Seattle General fell silent at 6:08 a.m. when Dr. Mercer projected Margaret's patient chart onto the wall. 20 residents and attending physicians sat arranged in tiered seating like an amphitheater, their coffee cups steaming in the air conditioning. He circled her dosage calculations in red marker, the pen moving with theatrical precision. "This," he announced, his voice carrying the weight of someone performing authority rather than possessing it, is what I call dangerous cowboy nursing. The red circle grew larger, swallowing the numbers. Notice the complete disregard for protocol. Nurse Walsh apparently believes her intuition supersedes pharmacology. Her nursing school, wherever it was, failed to teach her that medications require calculation, not guesswork. Laughter rippled through the room, the rehearsed kind that people make when they sense a predator feeding. A senior resident's shoulders shook. An intern smiled with the desperation of someone trying to belong to a tribe that hadn't claimed him yet. Margaret stood at the back of the room, arms crossed, her badge hanging against her scrubs like a weight pulling her down. Her eyes had gone the color of winter stone, flat, glacial, the kind of stare that made fluorescent light seem to dim around her. She didn't blink. She didn't shift her weight. She simply watched him perform his cruelty as if cataloging the exact moment a man chose pride over precision. Mercer kept circling, kept talking, kept building his audience's laughter like he was constructing a scaffold from which he could finally elevate himself above the invisible nurse who had questioned his dosage calculations during grand rounds 3 weeks earlier. That moment had shattered something in him, the public correction in front of a resident, the way she'd spoken to him as if they were colleagues rather than hierarchy. As if competence mattered more than title. When he finally turned and met her stare, his words faltered like a car engine choking on bad fuel. Her face was a closed door with no handle on the outside. Then she spoke, her voice carrying the kind of calm that comes from having already survived the worst. "Your hands are shaking, doctor. Maybe sit down before you hurt yourself." She turned and walked out. Behind her, the silence pressed down like a physical weight. Mercer's face flushed from his jaw upward, a crimson tide rising across his neck. The red marker in his hand trembled. He set it on the podium with exaggerated care, as if violence might escape if he didn't control every muscle in his arm. An attending physician began organizing papers with sudden intensity. The residents found their shoes fascinating. Margaret's footsteps echoed down the hallway outside, a steady rhythm, each step a word. "I am not afraid of you. I have seen worse than you. I will not pretend otherwise." 3 weeks passed. Margaret moved through Seattle General's night shifts like a ghost that had learned to interact with the living without becoming one of them. She changed fours on the comatose Green Beret in room for 47, whispered to him during the quiet hours when the hospital's machinery seemed to breathe in unison, charted her observations with the precision that had made Mercer's professional doubt metastasize into something uglier. The second attack found her by the vending machine on the 3rd floor, where the fluorescent lights buzzed in a pattern that reminded her of helicopter rotors in the distance. She was feeding quarters into the coffee dispenser when she realized Mercer was there, holding court with 3 surgical interns like a cardinal displaying his plumage to lesser birds. "I'm not saying she bought her license online," he said, his voice modulated to carry without appearing to project, "but I've seen more medical knowledge in a mall first aid course. 5 hours with the Red Cross and you know more than half-hour night shift staff. Norfolk standards must be slipping. Or maybe they just don't screen applications anymore." The intern's eyes darted toward Margaret, then away. That quick glance was the real tell. They felt the weight of his words like stones in their pockets, knew that disagreeing meant risking his attention. Margaret collected her coffee and turned from the machine. The cup was still too hot to hold, but she held it anyway, crossing the space between them in 4 steps that sounded like the approach of something inevitable. She stopped beside him, and the cologne he wore, something expensive, something that screamed compensation, couldn't hide the fact that his shirt clung to his armpits with yesterday's sweat. "That cologne can't hide day-old sweat," she said simply. "Try showering before your shift." She walked away while they were still processing the sentence. Behind her, one of the interns actually snorted. Mercer's jaw clenched so hard that she heard his teeth grind from 15 feet away. 7 more weeks collapsed into a pattern, medication orders that made her pause, charts that required reading between the clinical lines, a man whose professional jealousy was metastasizing into something more strategic. His attacks had begun to calculate rather than merely perform. He reassigned staff away from her during shifts. He made calls, she heard about them secondhand from nurses in the break room, whispered conversations about concerns raised with administration. He was building a case the way men like him always did, carefully, methodically, with documentation that would look like concern rather than cruelty. The final escalation came on a Thursday night at the nurse's station. Margaret was reviewing the Green Beret's medication orders when Mercer appeared with 2 security guards flanking him like an honor guard for his own importance. His voice carried across the entire floor, loud enough that every nurse within 30 feet froze mid-keystroke. "If you continue practicing medicine without a license," he said, each word separated by a pause designed to let it hang in the air, "I will have you escorted from this building." "That's a promise, not a threat." The security guards stood with their hands near their belts, young men uncertain whether they were here to protect the hospital or to assist a surgeon in settling professional scores. One of them actually shifted his weight, as if preparing to move. The fluorescent lights hummed their insistent white noise. Somewhere down the hallway, a ventilator wheezed its mechanical rhythm. Margaret set down her pen. She didn't make it sound, didn't let it click against the desk. She just released it, smooth and controlled, the way a sniper would set down a rifle after the shot had already left the barrel. Then she met his eyes. 3 seconds. Long enough for him to recognize that she was looking at him the way a combat surgeon might look at a training mannequin, with clinical detachment, seeing exactly where the damage was and how little it mattered. "Is that what you tell yourself when you can't sleep?" she asked. Her voice was quiet. Not meek, not deferential, quiet the way the moment before an explosion is quiet. She turned back to her paperwork as if he'd already left the room. As if he'd ceased to exist in any meaningful way. Mercer's jaw clenched so hard she heard his teeth grind. The security guards exchanged a glance. One of them actually stepped backward, and that step was an acknowledgement that the territory had shifted, that the threat wasn't standing in front of them but sitting at a keyboard with her hand steady as surgical lasers. He left without another word. What he didn't understand, what he couldn't understand from inside his own wounded ego, was that Margaret Walsh had stopped being afraid of him somewhere between his first red marker circle and his promise of security escorts. Fear was a luxury of people with something to lose. Margaret had spent 11 months serving a mission that swallowed her entire professional identity. A surgeon's wounded pride registered as background noise, no more significant than the ventilator's mechanical breathing or the fluorescent light's insistent hum. But that wasn't the worst part. The real crisis had already begun before Mercer's threats crystallized in the air of that nurse's station, before the security guards retreated from a confrontation that had ended before it started. At 0200 hours the following night, Margaret would find something hanging from the Green Beret central line that wasn't in any official orders, and the choice she'd have to make would demand something far more costly than her composure. She didn't know it yet, but her time at Seattle General was measured now in hours, not months. The quiet night shift nurse who had absorbed every insult without fracturing was about to be forced into a decision that would burn away everything she'd built in this life. And when it happened, there would be no red marker circles, no vending machine commentary, no security guard standing in her way. There would only be the sound of her own heartbeat and the weight of orders she could not obey without letting a man die. The shift change happened at 2300 hours, Margaret's badge clipping softly against her collarbone as she moved through the stairwell at Seattle General. Room for 47 sat at the end of the north corridor, past the supply closet where residents sometimes slept between traumas, past the vending machine that had become Dr. Mercer's theater for performance and poison. She'd worked 11 months in this building. 11 months of invisible hands, invisible competence, invisible rank. Tonight she was moving toward something that would either end her mission or end a man's life. The air in the stairwell smelled like antiseptic and something else, the metallic tang of fear, though whose, she hadn't yet determined. The Green Beret's chart sat in the pneumatic tube system outside his room, a thin manila folder that had accumulated weight like sediment. Margaret retrieved it, her weathered fingers, the ones Dr. Mercer had mocked in front of residents as belonging in a kitchen, not a hospital, turned to page 3 where the medication orders lived. There. New handwriting. Dr. Mercer's precise, arrogant script. The benzodiazepine protocol had changed. Doubled, actually. Lorazepam increased from 4 milligrams every 8 hours to 8 milligrams every 6. Clinical justification, none. Note section blank. Just the order, standing alone like a monument to power used poorly. Margaret sat in the break room for exactly 90 seconds. The fluorescent fixtures overhead cast everything in institutional white. She didn't remove her shoes. She didn't remove her jacket. She simply read the order again, then read it a third time, because in 3 reads a pattern emerged. This wasn't treating agitation. This wasn't managing pain. This was a man trying to keep another man unconscious. A man trying to ensure that the patient stayed sedated long enough to prevent any complications that might validate Margaret's clinical judgment, any awakening that might prove her right about his negligence, any moment of consciousness that could contradict the narrative he'd been building since the day she'd questioned his math in front of a resident. The brilliance of it made her jaw tighten. Not because Mercer was brilliant, he wasn't, but because he understood institutional power the way a shark understands water. He knew that a patient who stayed unconscious couldn't validate or contradict anything. A patient who stayed unconscious couldn't be saved by a nurse. A patient who stayed unconscious couldn't be a threat to a surgeon's reputation. Mercer had moved from humiliation to sabotage in the span of 48 hours. From public mockery to subtle poisoning. From theater to genuine malice. Margaret documented everything. Not confrontationally. Not with accusations. Just fact. Clinical assessment at 2,347 hours, benzodiazepine protocol increase appears to lack clinical indication. Patient shows no signs of agitation, pain response within normal limits, no respiratory compromise requiring enhanced sedation. Recommend review of order with attending physician before administration. Signature. Badge number. Timestamp. She created a paper trail because paper trails existed outside of institutional power. Paper trails lived in medical records, in accreditation audits, in the files that federal agencies requested during investigations. She was building a wall of documentation that would prove, later, that she had tried every protocol method before doing what came next. The patient's room sat dark except for the glow of the monitor. Margaret moved through the doorway the way she'd learned to move through doorways in Tikrit, weight distributed, hands visible, no sudden motions that cameras could misinterpret. The Green Beret lay propped at 30 degrees, a position that looked comfortable but was actually a compromise between his broken ribs and the ventilator's requirements. His eyes were closed. His hands lay above the blanket, palms up, a gesture of unconsciousness so complete it seemed almost performed. She checked the fall line. Mercer's order sat in the queue, scheduled to run at 0300 hours. Approximately 3 hours from now. Approximately 3 hours before the patient would sink even deeper into pharmaceutical sleep, before his consciousness would become a theoretical concept rather than a clinical reality. Margaret's fingers paused over the medication dispenser, that moment of hesitation that looked like human doubt but was actually something else. Strategic deliberation. Tactical assessment. The kind of pause that separates amateurs from operators. She couldn't challenge Mercer directly. A direct challenge would require her to explain how she understood medication protocols at a level that no floor nurse should possess. It would require her to demonstrate clinical knowledge that contradicted her 11-month cover identity as an unremarkable night shift staff member. It would require her to blow 8 months of intelligence work, the kind of work that involved Pentagon authorization codes and communication channels that existed in phone systems no hospital administrator would ever know to search for. Blowing her cover would terminate the entire operation. It would also leave the Green Beret without any protection at all. So she would monitor him. She would watch his vitals with the precision of someone who'd held lives together in field hospitals under mortar fire. She would document his response to the sedation increase in real time, creating a record of what happened when a surgeon tried to keep a soldier asleep against his body's own chemistry. She would be present, visible, documented in the chart at every moment that Mercer's protocol began to fail. And when the next crisis came, and she could smell it coming like rain before thunder, she would be standing exactly where she needed to be. Margaret pulled the patient's left arm closer to the monitor, checking the foresight for infiltration. The catheter was patent. The tubing ran clean. She noted the time. 2,352 hours. The night was just beginning. The silence in room for 47 felt heavy, the kind of silence that precedes earthquakes. She could hear the ventilator's rhythmic hiss, the monitor's steady electronic pulse, the distant sound of the ER down 2 floors where actual chaos was unfolding. Up here, in the quiet dark, there was only the sound of her own breathing and the weight of orders she could not obey without letting a man die. The decision had already been made. Not tonight. Not yet. But soon. In the next few hours, the Green Beret's body would begin to rebel against Mercer's pharmaceutical programming. His oxygen saturation would drift. His breathing pattern would shift. The machines would start speaking a language that only Margaret could fully interpret. And in that moment, when protocol collided with survival, when the rulebook offered only death, she would move. Not as a nurse. Not as an invisible staff member following chain of command. But as the person she actually was, the one who'd walked out of Tikrit carrying a man's name in her memory like a prayer, the one who'd volunteered for this shift, this hospital, this 11-month vigil because her son's commanding officer had asked her to watch over him, to make sure that when he woke up, if he woke up, there would be at least one person in this building who understood what he'd endured. She stepped back from the bed, letting the shadows reclaim the room. Mercer's sedation order would run on schedule. The patient would sink deeper. And Margaret Walsh would sit in the corner of that room, chart in her lap, watching and waiting like every quiet warrior learns to do, with the kind of patience that comes from having already survived the worst this world could offer. The clock in room for 47 reads 0347 when the Green Beret's breathing changes. Margaret knows the sound of a healthy chest, the bilateral symmetry of it, the whisper of air moving equally through both lungs. This isn't that. This is asymmetric. This is shallow on the left side, almost absent. She's out of the chair before the thought completes. Her hands move on muscle memory, the kind that lives in 23 years of field work and 47 combat medevacs. Absent breath sounds on the left. Trachea deviated. The signs stack like dominoes and she's already seeing what's happening inside his chest, the tension building, the pressure mounting, the collapsed lung filling with air that has nowhere to go. The patient's lips are turning blue. Not the gradual fade of hypoxia, but the rapid shift of a man suffocating in his own anatomy. His eyes flutter beneath closed lids, and Margaret moves to the ventilator, checks the settings, finds them exactly as Mercer set them, too much sedation, not enough respiratory support. The sabotage wasn't subtle. It was deliberate and clinical, the kind of harm that looks like medicine if nobody's watching closely enough. She was watching. The alarm on the cardiac monitor sounds exactly 4.7 seconds too late, and Margaret's already at the bedside with a prep kit. The 14-gauge catheter sits in her right hand, muscle memory speaking louder than protocol. Her left hand finds the second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line, anatomy she's found in the dark, found in the rain, found in operating theaters where the lights were out and the only guidance was training and touch. She doesn't hesitate. Hesitation is a luxury she surrendered years ago in a city whose name she still doesn't speak out loud. The needle goes in. The hiss of released pressure fills the room like an answered prayer, like the exhale after holding your breath underwater for 3 minutes, like a question that finally gets its reply. Air escapes. Pressure drops. The patient's chest rises fully for the first time in 4.2 minutes, the lung re-inflating, oxygen beginning its work again. The blue recedes from his lips like a tide reversing. Margaret holds the catheter steady, watching the O2 saturation climb, 68, 74, 81, 88, 92. Stable. The trembling in her hands isn't fear. It's restraint. It's the physical manifestation of a captain holding herself to civilian standards in a civilian hospital where nobody knows that she's already done this 47 times and every other time it was in the dark with mortars falling like rain. The patient's breathing deepens. His chest expands fully now, bilateral, symmetrical, the sound of a man who wants to live and whose body is finally willing to cooperate. Margaret secures the catheter with 2 pieces of tape, her fingers steady as surgical lasers, and then Dr. Mercer is in the doorway. He's wearing his bedside coat, the one he keeps in his on-call room, which means he wasn't asleep. He was waiting. hoping, maybe, that the patient would code so hard that nobody could blame him for the original sedation order, so the death would look natural instead of intentional. The look on Mercer's face when he sees the patient breathing, when he sees Margaret holding the catheter, is the look of a man whose leverage just evaporated. His jaw tightens. His hands curl into fists. He steps into the room and his voice comes out clipped, controlled, the voice of a man counting to 10 before he destroys someone. "What exactly did you do?" His words are a blade. Margaret doesn't turn from the patient. Needle decompression. Tension pneumothorax. You performed an invasive procedure without authorization. Without a resident present. Without. He was blue. For words. That's all the explanation a captain owes to a surgeon who tried to kill his patient through medication. Mercer's face goes the color of old brick. He pulls out his phone, scrolls, types something with his thumbs moving like weapons. He's not yelling anymore. The yelling was strategy. This is something colder. This is a man who understands that Margaret just won and he just lost, and he's calculating the cost of that loss against his future. She can see the moment he decides, if he can't destroy her reputation, he'll bury her in paperwork and procedure violations so deep that no hospital will touch her again. By midnight, she's been escorted from the building by security. The termination letter is printed on hospital letterhead and it uses words like unauthorized invasive procedures and a violation of hospital policy codes 3.7.2 through 3.7.9 and the dangerous pattern of independent decision-making. Mercer filed the incident report within an hour, a formal complaint by hour 2, and a memo to HR by hour 4 documenting what he called a pattern of dangerous independence. The memo cited her as a flight risk, a liability, a nurse who practiced medicine without a license despite her credentials being entirely legitimate. He checked. The credentials were real. So he attacked the judgment instead, the decision-making, the independence itself. Margaret's badge is in a plastic envelope in the security guard's hand. His name is Thompson and he looks embarrassed, like he knows exactly what just happened and exactly why it happened and exactly how little justice has to do with it. He walks her to the parking lot, his footsteps echoing across the pavement, and he doesn't say anything until they reach her car, a 2008 Honda Civic with 187,000 miles and rust spots forming like continents on the door panels. "For what it's worth," Thompson says, "everyone on the night shift knows you just saved him." Margaret takes the envelope. "That doesn't matter." "It will." Thompson's voice carries the certainty of a man who's worked security long enough to understand that the truth always surfaces, just usually too late to help anyone. It always does. She drives to the diner on Colley Avenue, the one with the broken oath in the neon sign so it reads like a question mark instead of a name. It's 02 for 7 hours and the place is empty except for a waitress named Carol who's been working nights for 16 years and who doesn't ask questions when Margaret sits in the booth by the window and orders coffee she doesn't plan to drink. The cup arrives steaming. The reflection of her face appears in the window glass, superimposed over the street outside, and she looks like a woman who traded her mission for a man's life. The math doesn't balance. 1 captain equals 1 patient equals 1 blown operation equals maybe 47 lives downstream that she'll never be able to save because she broke cover in a civilian hospital. She can justify it with 1,000 reasons, the medical imperative, the Geneva Convention, the basic human refusal to let someone die when you know how to stop it. None of those reasons change the operational calculation. The math still doesn't balance. Carol refills her cup at 0312 hours. The coffee is still untouched. Carol doesn't comment on this, just leaves the pot and disappears back into the kitchen where Margaret can hear her frying eggs for a construction crew coming off the graveyard shift. At home, Daniel is asleep in his room, 16 years old and convinced his mother is just a nurse working doubles to cover rent and keep the medical insurance current. He doesn't know she's Captain Margaret Walsh. He doesn't know that the unit patch sewn inside her jacket lining is from 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines, Dark Horse, the same unit his mother commanded when she was young enough to believe that rank meant something. He doesn't know his mother has a silver star folded inside a shadow box in the attic, hidden under winter coats and 3 layers of lies. He doesn't know that the Green Beret upstairs called himself the captain who brought us home when Daniel was 9 years old and on a video call from FOB Shank before the network cut out. Margaret sits in the diner booth and thinks about all the things her son doesn't know and all the reasons she made those things not knowable. When you have a child, you become a civilian. When you go dark, you stay dark. When you choose a mission, you leave your family on the other side of the fence and you don't look back. Except she looked back. She looked back at a mute Green Beret in room for 47 and she made the choice that costs everything. The sun rises at 0627. The diner gets busy. Construction workers order eggs and toast and complain about their knees. Nurses arriving for the early shift come in for coffee they can drink fast before they start their 8 hours of invisible labor. Margaret watches all of them through the window and understands that in 3.5 hours, her termination letter will be official. In 4.1 hours, her name will be on the hospital network as a failed employee, a safety risk, a nurse who overstepped. In 5 hours, no hospital in the Norfolk area will consider her application. The waitress refills her cup one more time. "You gonna eat something?" Margaret looks at the woman, at Carol, who's been on her feet for 11 hours and who's asking because she cares, not because the manager told her to upsell, and she almost smiles. Almost. The smile dies before it reaches her face because Margaret understands that kindness in the aftermath of destruction is sometimes the hardest thing to receive. No. She leaves cash on the table, 3.20s for a $6 coffee, because taking anything else today would be too much like admitting defeat. Thank you. The parking lot is empty now. The sun is behind the building, making everything gold and shadow. Margaret sits in her car with the door open and her hand steady on the steering wheel, and she allows herself exactly 47 seconds to understand what she's just done. She saved one man's life. She burned an 8-month operation. She lost her job. She revealed herself to exactly 0 people, which is the only small mercy in this arithmetic. Her phone sits on the passenger seat. Silent. No Pentagon call. No extraction. No voice telling her that breaking cover was the right call because the operation just became something bigger, something that needed her broken cover, something that validated the cost. That voice doesn't come. It won't come. Because she's not supposed to save Green Berets in civilian hospitals. She's supposed to fade into the background and collect information and vanish when her time is up. Instead, she's unemployed and her son is asleep at home and a man in room for 47 is breathing because she couldn't do the mission-critical thing, which was let him die. Margaret starts the car. The engine turns over, reliable, dependable, like everything else in her civilian life that's built on foundations of careful deception. She drives toward home, toward the house where Daniel is waking up, toward the moment when she has to explain why she's home at 0800 on a Tuesday when she should be finishing her night shift. She has a lie prepared. She's always prepared. The lies are automatic, the story threadbare but functional, staffing change, temporary layoff, budget restructuring. She doesn't know that in 3.2 hours, her son will walk into Seattle General with her shadow box. She doesn't know that the lobby will go silent like a held breath. She doesn't know that the math is about to change again, and that this time, the numbers will add up differently than anything she could have calculated at 0347 in an empty diner with cold coffee and the weight of a broken mission. She just knows that she saved him. She knows that was worth it. And she drives home to the life she built on secrets, not understanding yet that secrets, once spoken aloud, echo forever. Dr. Mercer's office door closed behind him at 1147 hours. His hands shook as he pulled up the personnel database, fingers moving across the keyboard with the precision that had made him a surgeon before it made him a liability. He needed Margaret's file. He needed to scrub the incident report, backdate some complaints, establish a pattern that would hold up under any review. 2 hours had passed since security walked her to the parking lot, and in that time something had shifted. The administrator's expression. The way the surgical interns had stopped meeting his eyes in the hallway. The message from the hospital's legal department marked urgent. He typed her name. Access denied, federal protection active. The words hung on his screen like a diagnosis he couldn't accept. He tried again. Same result. His jaw tightened. He navigated to the HR portal, the backup server, the scan personnel archives. Each door slammed shut in his face. Federal protection. The words didn't compute. She was a nurse. She wore discount scrubs. She'd been fired an hour ago. What federal protection? What protection could possibly apply to someone the hospital had just terminated? But Mercer was competent enough to understand what it meant. Federal protection didn't come from nursing boards or hospital unions. It came from one place. One agency. And it meant Margaret Walsh wasn't who she claimed to be. His phone rang. The hospital administrator. Her voice had changed, formal, careful, the way lawyers sound before they tell you something you don't want to hear. There were agents in the building. Federal agents. They wanted to discuss his access to personnel files over the past 3 hours. Specifically, his attempts to modify Margaret's documentation. His additions to her incident history. His timestamps that didn't align with reality. Mercer's mouth went dry. They'd watched him do it. They'd been watching her, which meant they'd been watching her file, which meant every keystroke he'd made since the needle decompression had been logged, recorded, catalogued as evidence. The falsified incident report from 2 years ago, the one he'd planted to establish a pattern of dangerous independence spanning months instead of hours. The complaint he'd backdated to reference equipment the hospital hadn't owned in 2023. The whole architecture of forgery constructed on the assumption that no one would look closely, that a chief of surgery's word carried weight, that paperwork told stories people believed. The knock on his office door came at 1,204 hours. 2 FBI agents stood in the hallway. Both wore dark suits that had nothing soft about them. Both had badge holders clipped to their belts and the kind of neutral expression that came from telling people the worst news of their lives without flinching. The female agent, gold wedding ring, sharp eyes that had assessed his office in the 3 seconds it took to walk from the doorframe, held a folder. Inside that folder were prints of his database activity. Every modification. Every timestamp. Every failed attempt to access a file that had been locked against him the moment he tried to tamper with it. Dr. Mercer, the male agent said. We need you to come with us. It wasn't a request. The words had the weight of procedure, the kind of certainty that came from knowing you'd already won before you said anything. Mercer thought about his lawyer. Thought about his career. Thought about the surgeon's hands now being cuffed as the agents explained 18 U.S.C. Section 1519, falsification of records in a federal investigation. 5 years minimum. His reputation gone in under an hour. His authority shattered by the same bureaucracy he'd assumed was subordinate to his position. The hallway was quiet as they walked him out. Shift change had just begun. Nurses emerged from supply closets and medication rooms. Residents paused in conversations. The vending machines where he'd spent afternoons assassinating Margaret's character now seemed to pulse with accusation. Everything he'd built, every reputation cultivated, every hierarchy enforced, every performance of superiority, evaporated like sweat under interrogation lights. Margaret watched from the 4th-floor window as the federal sedan pulled away from the parking lot, its taillights red against the November rain. The Green Beret stood beside her, his presence like a wall of quiet gratitude. He'd woken an hour earlier, his first words in 11 months a whispered call sign that had made the visiting Marine snap to attention and call for the hospital chaplain because some things were larger than medicine. He still moved like someone rebuilding himself from blueprints, but his eyes had clearness now, purpose, the look of someone who'd just remembered what he was fighting for. Thank you, he said. The words came rough, voiced like gravel in a canyon. For keeping me alive. For keeping them all alive. Before Margaret could respond, Daniel appeared in the hallway, breathless, soaked from running, carrying the shadow box he'd pulled from the attic that morning. Her son. 16 years old. Holding the evidence of a life she'd compartmentalized so completely that even he'd forgotten what his mother's hands had held. What his mother's rank meant. What the patch inside her jacket represented. The elevator doors opened. A two-star general stepped out, followed by two Pentagon staffers in civilian clothes, both carrying briefcases, both with the kind of authority that made hospital security straighten their posture without being told. The general's uniform carried decorations that meant operations in 3 theaters, decisions that had cost and saved lives in equal measure, the kind of responsibility that wore on shoulders differently than surgery ever could. The lobby had gone silent. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, each buzz a countdown to revelation. "Captain Walsh," the general said. Not a question. A statement of fact. A title that had been waiting for decades to be spoken aloud in this place where Margaret had spent 11 months as someone else. "You're coming with us." It wasn't a request. It was a command. And it was the moment everything changed. In that silence, the kind of stillness that only comes when people understand they've been wrong about someone fundamental, Margaret turned to face the assembled staff. Nurses who'd pitied her. Residents who'd dismissed her. The administrator standing near the information desk with her hand over her mouth. Daniel holding the shadow box open to reveal its contents, the silver star. The unit citations. The photographs from Tikrit, from the field hospital, from moments when a captain with steady hands had held an entire platoon together through mortar fire and blood loss and the weight of command. "I need to speak with you," she said to the general, her voice dropping an octave, that military precision returning like a muscle memory of who she actually was. "Away from the hospital." "Already arranged," he replied. "Helicopter is inbound. ETA for minutes." The rotor wash would shake the windows 15 seconds after the Black Hawk appeared on the eastern horizon. The lobby would erupt into conversation the moment she stepped through those doors. By evening, the story would be told differently, not as a dismissal, but as a classified operation that had finally borne fruit. By tomorrow, Dr. Mercer's name would be struck from the hospital directory. By next week, his license application to teach basic CPR at a community college in Oregon would be processed and approved, the only job he'd be qualified to hold after federal prison and disbarment. But that was future tense. That was consequence unfolding like a court case written in slow motion. Right now, Margaret touched her son's face once, the gesture brief, military, the kind of contact between operators that communicated entire sentences in a single moment of contact. She pulled the unit patch from her jacket lining, the one that matched the patch her son now wore in a different version of his own rebellion, and placed it in the Green Beret's hand. "He came home because of you," the Green Beret whispered. "All of them did." Margaret nodded. Picked up the shadow box Daniel had brought. Turned toward the general waiting by the elevator. The two Pentagon staffers moved to flank her position, their bodies' language announcing security, announcing that this conversation was now federally protected in ways the hospital could never understand. The elevator doors closed. The rotor wash arrived exactly on schedule. Through the windows, Norfolk's skyline tilted as the Black Hawk banked hard toward the helipad. Margaret was already gone, not disappeared, but elevated into a version of reality where night shift nursing was a cover story and federal protection meant something more than hospital policy could encompass. By 1900 hours, Seattle General would return to normal. By tomorrow's shift, the story would already be mythology, the quiet nurse who'd been more than a nurse. By next month, there would be a replacement on the night shift, someone unremarkable, someone steady, someone who would monitor unconscious patients with hands that had learned long ago that power isn't a title. Power is the ability to help. Power is knowing when to stay silent and when to act. Power is the choice to keep someone alive when the world has written them off. Power is understanding that the smallest person in the room might be the one holding everything together, might be the one who's already survived the worst and learned what matters. Margaret's phone would ring before the helicopter touched down at Langley. Another posting. Another identity. Another hospital where someone needed watching, where a mute patient or a forgotten soldier or a child in the ICU required the kind of protection that came from someone willing to work night shift forever if that's what the mission required. She'd accept the assignment. Because that's what operators do. Because her son was old enough now to understand that his mother's absence meant something larger than missing school pickups. Because the patch in her jacket, the one with his unit designation stitched inside, meant she was never really gone. She was just working somewhere else, keeping someone else's children alive. The Pentagon would file her paperwork that night. Federal protection. Classified clearance. Authorization for everything she'd done, everything she would do, everything that had happened at Seattle General would be sealed and buried and redacted until history forgot there was ever a story to tell. But the Green Beret would remember. Daniel would remember. The surgical residents who'd watched her work would spend their careers wondering if that quiet nurse had been more than they thought. And somewhere in a community college office in Oregon, Dr. Mercer would teach CPR on minimum wage, his surgeon's hands now teaching teenagers how to compress a chest, how to breathe for someone else, how to keep another person alive, a lesson written in felony charges and federal imprisonment, or education paid for in career destruction and humiliation. Power, he would learn too late, isn't what you take. It's what you're allowed to keep. And Margaret Walsh had always known exactly how much to keep and how much to surrender. It was the difference between a captain and a chief of surgery. It was the difference between someone who understood command and someone who'd only ever understood control. The difference between someone the Pentagon protected and someone the FBI arrested on a rainy afternoon in Norfolk, Virginia. The difference between two people who'd collided in a hospital hallway for 11 months, neither of them understanding that they'd been locked in a battle where one side had already won before the first insult was ever spoken. If you've ever been underestimated by someone who didn't know who you actually were, if you've ever had to watch someone abuse power without being able to stop them, subscribe for more stories about the quiet heroes walking among us, the ones we never see until the truth comes out. Like and comment below. Would you have revealed who you really were to save your career, or would you have kept the secret the way Margaret did?